Welcome to NTD Newsroom. I'm Don Ma. President Trump on the chances of a meeting with Russia's Vladimir Putin in Budapest, and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban hailing a new golden age of U.S.-Hungary relations. More than 2,000 flights have been delayed or canceled this morning after the FAA initiated cuts at 40 major airports as the shutdown drags on. What to know if you're flying or booking flights in the near future. Cornell University has agreed to pay $60 million in order to get federal funding back. The Ivy League institution must also comply with civil rights laws. The state of Michigan concerned by the constant probing of military installations by Chinese nationals. The head of the Michigan National Guard says these are not isolated incidents.
This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
President Trump says there's a very good chance he'll meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Budapest. This as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban hails a golden age of U.S.-Hungary relations while seeking exemptions to U.S. sanctions on Russian oil. We now go live to NTD's Washington correspondent Mari Otsu, who's at the White House. Mari, good afternoon. Can you tell us what is the latest on President Trump's efforts to end the Russia-Ukraine war?
Don, good afternoon. Yes, President Trump today is now saying that there's a, quote, very good chance that he'll be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Budapest, but that he'll have more to say about this potential Putin meeting after his lunch with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, citing that Orban, quote, knows and understands Putin very well. Meanwhile, President Trump also says that he's considering sanctions exemptions for Hungary. Here's his reasoning. Take a look.
Because it's very difficult for him to get the oil and gas from other areas. As you know, they don't have the advantage of having sea. They don't have the ports, and so they have a difficult problem. There's another country that has that same problem, by the way. But when you look at what's happened with Europe, many of those countries they don't have those problems, and they buy a lot of oil and gas from Russia. And as they know, I'm very disturbed by that.
This is coming after President Trump imposed what he called a tremendous sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies back at the end of October, while calling on Moscow to immediately agree to a ceasefire. And according to the Atlantic Council Research Group, Hungary imports 86% of its oil from Russia. And Orban is saying that an exemption to sanctions is needed, as Hungary is a landlocked country that's completely dependent on Russian pipelines for its energy supply. And as to the relations between the two leaders, there was much mutual praise in the meeting, with Orban hailing the meeting as a restoration of U.S.-Hungary relations after what he calls a, quote, broken, ruined relationship during the previous administration. Take a look.
So now we are in quite a good position to open up a new chapter, let's say a golden age between the United States and Hungary, and we have plenty of suggestions for today: economic cooperation, military cooperation, and political cooperation. We are kind of a special island of difference in a liberal ocean in Europe, and we consider ourselves as a modern Christian government. That's the proper category to describe what we are doing.
Orban also says that the only pro-peace governments are the U.S. and Hungary. He says that other governments prefer to continue the war because they think that Ukraine can win it, calling that a, quote, misunderstanding of the situation. But there was a moment in the meeting when President Trump turned and asked him if Ukraine can win, and Orban responds, miracles can happen. Don, back to you.
Okay, Mari, thank you. To discuss the meeting between President Trump and Hungary Prime Minister Orban, we're bringing in Jim Gilmore, former U.S. ambassador for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So, Ambassador, always great to have you on the show. So I want to ask you, during their meeting, Trump and Orban discussed recent sanctions on Russian oil, which have significantly affected Hungary. So, Ambassador, could you tell us about the scope of Hungary's reliance on Russian oil?
Well, the press conference today was actually very revealing. Number one, I don't disapprove in any way of the president meeting with Viktor Orban. I think that anytime you have diplomacy between sovereign states, that's a good thing to be doing. So I don't have a problem with that. I think what the press conference today revealed is Hungary's uniquely vulnerable position to Russian oil. They're the source that they can get their energy from. They're dependent upon it. And so Orban is here today. President Orban is here today to talk about an exemption from American sanctions as a result of that unique position. The president has acknowledged that position, and I think they're going to talk about that. My concern, of course, is to make sure that Hungary remains on the right side of this international conflict between Russia and the rest of the world.
So Trump said he may consider exempting Hungary from the sanctions because he said it's very difficult for Hungary to get oil and gas from other areas, as you just mentioned now. So, Ambassador, I know you've expressed concern over Orban's relationship with Russia and President Putin. Is there a risk at all to providing Hungary with an exemption?
Well, I think the risk there would be that many of the other European countries would say, well, heck, why not us? We have the same kind of pressures and the same kind of difficulties, and you're trying to get us to move away from Russian energy, but you're exempting Hungary. Why would that be the case? That's a double standard. And so that threatens the overall position of the United States relative to the Russian energy problem. We need to remember what's really going on here. Nobody's trying to be mean to anybody. This is a case where Russia is dependent upon energy sales in order to keep its country afloat. And more than that, to take their financial resources and feed it into their war machine, which is an act of aggression against Ukraine, which is also an act of aggression against Europe, which ultimately is an act of aggression against the United States. So we need to recognize the complexities of this and find ways to make sure that Hungary doesn't get on the side of the aggressors in this world conflict that's going on.
So to your point, Ambassador, Orban has been referred to as, quote, Putin's Trojan horse in the EU by his critics, which is a rather strong statement here. What actions would you say have caused him to be characterized this way?
Well, President Orban has taken Hungary on a road that is against the European Union in a lot of ways. And he's very reasonable in his arguments about that. He talks about how the European Union is trying to impose itself on Hungary at a time when Hungary wants to be more independent. So he's making that case. But the real danger here continues to be that Hungary might shift over to being a supporter of Putin as a result of their energy independence, but their energy dependence on Russia. That is not in the American national interest. It is not in the European interest to have a country move in that particular direction. But look at your map. Hungary is landlocked, and it makes it very, very difficult for them to operate. But we have to find ways to do that. We have to find ways to make sure that Hungary remains on the right side of the conflict, even though they have a vulnerability.
So, Ambassador, I'm sure the President Trump is aware of the risks and all the facts here. He didn't mention them publicly, but what do you think is his strategy here?
Well, I think he's going to talk things over with Orban and try to square this circle. He's going to try to make sure. Look, at present, the president is doing the right thing, in my view, which is to basically say to Putin, "Look, you're not going to be permitted to win this. You're not going to be permitted to win in Ukraine." I think that President Orban has a different view. By the way, he has said in the press conference today, "Well, Ukraine can't win," but at the same time, I think we have to ask the question: should Ukraine win? Is it in the long-term interest of the world that Ukraine win? Is it in the long-term interest that Putin win? Putin, if he prevails, I believe is on the road to a reassembly of the old Russian Empire, which, by the way, includes Hungary, and beginning to actually re-change the way that the world works. That is not in the American national interest and should not be allowed. So when President Orban makes statements like, well, Ukraine can't win, I think he's ignoring the strategic implications of this. Russia has already lost the strategy. Their goal to take over Ukraine lock, stock, and barrel is still their pronounced intention. That's why there is no peace talks going on, because Russia is unrelenting on this. But nevertheless, these are the strategic issues that are being dealt with. Russia cannot conquer Ukraine, is not going to be permitted to conquer Ukraine. If President Orban implies to Putin that it's possible strategically, I think he's prolonging the war.
So, Ambassador, I also wanted to talk to you about this, about the Hungarian Prime Minister's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. So last year, Hungary and China elevated their relationship to a, quote, all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership for the new era. So Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping and Orban also signed more than a dozen cooperation agreements. That's including on infrastructure, tech, national security. So in your view, Ambassador, does this pose a national security threat to the U.S. and as well the EU?
I think you have to look carefully at what those kinds of relationships are and whether or not they're a threat to the international order or not. Now you're moving away from strictly European issues and ultimately Russia's global interests into a much larger issue, which goes beyond Russia into China and even beyond that to Iran and North Korea. There is a global conflict going on for the 21st century right now. It's perfectly clear that that's what's going on. China is clearly trying to remake the international order, and they're doing it right now in combination with Russia. In the long run, Russia is threatened by China. There's no doubt about that. But because Putin has launched this unfortunate war, he's now driven into a partnership with China, who's keeping him afloat. Now, Hungary, of course, is sort of a bit player in this, to the extent that they are making themselves dependent on China. That would be just as dangerous as a dependency on Russia. I think Hungary is in a difficult position because of their energy needs. But at the end of the day, Hungary, in my view, should be trying to find ways to make it clear to Russia and China that they're not going to side with them in this international conflict.
So what can the president do to ensure that Hungary is more aligned to the U.S. rather than to China or Russia?
I think that they have to find ways to get Hungary less dependent on both China and on Russia in order to liberate Hungary to be more productive and more helpful in the international situation. And that is something I think that the president is going to talk to Hungary about today. The concern is always that there would be a shift back towards being more positive towards Putin. Putin is a war criminal. He has national objectives on behalf of Russia, which in my judgment are delusional. We should not be mollycoddling that. We should not be favoring that. And to the extent that Hungary is forced to do that, I think that's not helpful.
Well, okay, Ambassador, it was very intriguing listening to your insight today. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for the chance to be with you.
It's day 38 of the government shutdown. Senate Republicans tee up a vote on a package of bills to end the shutdown. But Democrats publicly maintain their maximalist demands. Our Washington correspondent Luis Eduardo Martinez has more on this story.
Pressure is piling up to reopen government as flight cancellations hit major airports nationwide on the first day of the FAA's flight reduction. Senate Republicans have offered yet another off-ramp to Democrats to reopen government by teeing up a series of votes on an extended continuing resolution, a trio of appropriation bills, a bill to pay federal employees, and a promise to vote on the extension of Affordable Care Act healthcare subsidies.
You're going to have a vote today, but if you fail, you're going to be having a vote on Sunday. You're going to work through the weekend.
I think that should be the expectation.
Some Democratic senators who have traditionally favored bipartisan compromise have signaled that they will keep government closed until they have guarantees that their policy demands are met.
I think there's a real gravity to what happened on Tuesday. The electorate spoke really clearly. It was mostly a referendum on Trump's corruption and his chaos, but voters were telling Democrats they want us to stand up for what we believe in, and they want us to use our power to try to keep costs down.
Senate Republicans have made the case that the Affordable Care Act and the enhanced healthcare subsidies have benefited the insurance companies more than the American people.
441%. Humana, 490%. They need to up their game. MOLINA, whoever they are, 859%. SCNTNE, 604%. Aetna, 595% since the passage of this bill.
Senate and House Republicans maintain that they will not guarantee the extension of the ACA subsidies without significant debate and reform.
We are not, as Republicans, going to continue what you've created, a windfall for healthcare insurance companies, inflationary mechanisms in healthcare without an end. We're going to stop and fix what you created in 2010.
President Trump has insisted upon Senate Republicans that they should end the filibuster and reopen government.
He just wants to, he obviously wants to be a part of solving this problem. And as I've said, he's willing to sit down on the issue of health care with Democrats once the government opens up again.
Senate Republicans have maintained that they will not vote to end the filibuster. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
And a top economic advisor for President Trump says the government shutdown is worse than expected. Here's Kevin Hassett speaking on Fox Business earlier today.
The impact on the economy is far worse than we expected because it's gone on for so long. And so there are now Goldman estimates that it's over 1% or 1.5% of GDP. I think we were thinking that we're going to have at least 3% growth in the fourth quarter. I think now we're expecting something like half that because of the harm by the Democrats' policy. And so,
Democrats are pushing for specific health care demands. They want to undo GOP Medicaid cuts and extend Obamacare subsidies. Hassett said the travel and leisure sector is heavily hit by the shutdown. He warned that this has ripple effects, such as fewer business deals being made. He said permits are also not being processed and construction projects are starting to slow down. Hassett also pointed out that the shutdown will discourage people from taking government jobs and harm efficient government operation in the long run. But he said he expects the U.S. economy to bounce back quickly once the federal government reopens. Next, the government shutdown is now at the 38th day. Senators are speaking on the Senate floor to debate. Let's take a listen to Senate Majority Leader John Thune.
Working for the American people. Democrats have said we must address the health care crisis. But Republicans have repeatedly said they won't negotiate to lower the health care costs until the government reopens. So let's find a path to honor both positions. Democrats would like to see an end to this shutdown, and we want to respect Leader Thune's desire not to negotiate on ACA until after the government reopens. Therefore, we'd like to offer a simple proposal that would reopen the government and extend the ACA premium tax credits simultaneously, and then have the opportunity to start negotiating longer-term solutions to health care costs. Let's do all three. I've spoken with my caucus, and Democrats are offering a very simple compromise. Democrats are ready to clear the way to quickly pass a government funding bill that includes health care affordability. Leader Thune just needs to add a clean one-year extension of the ACA tax credits to the CR so that we can immediately address rising health care costs. That's not a negotiation. It's an extension of current law, something we do all the time around here, as we all know. But we also offer this. Let's create a bipartisan committee that will continue negotiations after the government reopens on reforms, ahead of next year's enrollment period, to provide long-term certainty that health care costs will be more affordable. This proposal reopens the government and ensures working families who are shopping right now for their health care get certainty and financial relief. While open enrollment has begun, insurers can update their rates after we pass a simple extension of the tax credits. With this approach, we do not negotiate health care in the shutdown, as Leader Thune has maintained he wishes, and the American people get the tax credit extension they want. That is what many of our Republican colleagues have floated over the last 6 weeks as a compromise: a one-year tax credit extension and reforms to the credit beyond that. We will agree with the Republican request not to start negotiations until after the government reopens. All Republicans have to do is say yes to extend current law for 1 year. It makes sense. And since what we're proposing is only a simple extension of current law, the Senate could do this within a few hours. This is a reasonable offer that reopens the government, deals with health care affordability, and begins a process of negotiating reforms to the ACA tax credits for the future. Now, the ball is in the Republicans' court. We need Republicans to just say yes. I yield to Senator Peters.
Thank you, Leader Schumer.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam President.
And that was Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer proposing a new method to end the government shutdown, saying now the ball is in the Republicans' court and they just need Republicans to say yes to this new proposal. The Trump administration is asking a federal appeals court to pause a judge's order to fully fund SNAP benefits. The administration says there is only enough money for a partial payment in November. In a court filing, the administration called the situation a crisis by congressional failure, saying it can only be solved by congressional action. NTD's Daniel Monahan has more on yesterday's court decision.
Rhode Island Judge John McConnell Jr. says the Department of Agriculture must pay states the money by today. It will go to approximately 42 million recipients of SNAP. McConnell said, "People have gone without for too long. Not making payments to them for even another day is simply unacceptable." USDA officials had declined to fund SNAP amid the government shutdown, arguing that they could not use emergency funding or revenue from tariffs. The administration had only partially funded the program, citing limits on contingency funds and reluctance to tap tariff revenue. But McConnell said that decision violated his earlier order and caused irreparable harm. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt responded that the administration has been complying, saying the president is using emergency funds meant for war and catastrophes because of the ongoing government shutdown. Vice President J.D. Vance criticized the ruling, calling it absurd.
Because you have a federal judge effectively telling us what we have to do in the midst of a Democrat government shutdown.
Vance blamed the Democrats and called on them to open the government.
Then we can fund SNAP, and we can also do a lot of other good things for the American people. But in the midst of a shutdown, we can't have a federal court telling the president how he has to triage the situation.
The judge's order was in response to a challenge from cities and nonprofits, complaining the administration was only offering to cover 65% of the maximum benefit. Lawyers for the Trump administration filed a motion to appeal shortly after the judge's ruling. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
FlightAware shows that more than 2,000 flights were delayed or canceled this morning. Joining us to discuss is Armin Kurdian, pilot and aviation expert. He's also a retired U.S. Navy captain and currently a California Senate candidate. So Armin, good afternoon. Can you tell us what are the risks that emerge from staffing shortages, with air traffic controllers?
Hi, Don. It's quite simple. It's a question of capacity. Any complex system, you don't want it running on a long-term basis at 100%. So your 100% number is something that you may want to, you might touch now and then, but you don't want that to continue to go on. The fact that a lot of controllers have simply said, look, I can't come to work because I'm not getting paid. I got to go get a second job, or I'm just not taking it. It's too stressful. They were already working a lot of overtime ahead of time. So this is the right decision. And it's a necessary decision. It's an unfortunate decision that we have to actually do this. And a lot of passengers are now paying the price for this Democrat-run government shutdown.
So Armin, can you explain for us, how do the cuts to flights benefit day-to-day operations at airports? For example, what does it look like inside a control tower when there's fewer flights?
Well, you've got fewer controllers. It's quite that simple. You've got guys who may have to take on two different corridors at the same time. Any controllers, there's a certain number of flights that they can take onto their scope before they have to pass them off. And if there just aren't as many controllers that are available, you've got to necessarily reduce the number of flights that are coming into and out of that airspace sector, whether you are an approach controller, whether you are, center, which, controls the airspace above 18,000 feet. and even maybe some of the folks working in some of the towers, potentially in some of the heaviest airspace that we have in the United States. So, there's less people, so less traffic. So the overall average workload needs to remain the same for those controllers because they can't keep redlining like this.
Maybe you can describe for us some of the key tasks specifically that air traffic controllers must perform.
Absolutely. So an air traffic controller, any aircraft that's on an instrument flight plan is going to be talking to an air traffic controller on approach control or center control. And the controller is going to have a list of those aircraft that are coming through, where it took off from, where its destination is, what its what its path is, the route that it's actually taking. Nowadays you have a lot of commercial aircraft that are going direct point to point between airports thanks to a GPS and reduced navigation separation minimums. So technology has allowed us to pack more aircraft into our airspace, actually more safely, so folks can understand that through technology as used as GPS, a long way from where we were about 30 or 40 years ago. They'll tell the aircraft, where they are. They will give aircraft traffic advisories. The folks on approach will clear an aircraft for, say, to begin their final approach into an airport, give them vectors for traffic, provide them other advisory information, or handle other kinds of requests. They are basically the pilot's connection to the ground as they are traversing U.S. airspace.
So, Armin, given what you just described, in the event that there is a shortage, then what do controllers have to do to maintain safety?
Well, number one, they can't be overloaded. They can only, they're human beings. They can only manage so much traffic. So if there are less controllers, then there has to be less air traffic unnecessarily in order to manage that. The air traffic controllers are working exceptionally hard. It's a very stressful job. Granted, everybody has to remember that one of the reasons we are short on air traffic controllers is the retirement age is too young. It's like 56 or 58. They need to be, they can work, past the age of 60. Some of them can, in a limited capacity. That's a tremendous amount of experience. It takes a long time to train air traffic controllers at the same time, coming in, just like we have, a serious commercial pilot shortage for airline transport pilots is also a big problem. So, technology can only go so far. At the end of the day, there still has to be humans in the loop in this system. It's less humans than were required previously. So, I don't know exactly what the number is, but I can guarantee you the number of aircraft that a current senior air controller can manage or is allowed to manage is higher than what it used to be. It's a lot less labor intensive, but at the same time, even though each aircraft and each flight is less labor intensive to manage, the more you add, you're still adding up to a certain workload, at which the regional air traffic management agencies have been saying, we're pushing the limits here. We can't get people to come in and cover these flights, so we've got to we have to cancel flights for air traffic management.
So I have another question here, Armin. Given the circumstances right now, the government is shut down, people aren't getting paid. Is reducing flights the most effective way to ensure safety? Are there any other options?
Honestly, there really aren't, given the current circumstances that we're working in. I mean, we're always trying to improve the technology of our air traffic management system, improved radars, improved communications links, more reliable, more robust communications links, and surveillance. That's all coming down the pike. It's taking a long time for that to happen, but that's not going to happen in the span of a couple of weeks. The only option you really have is to reduce the capacity of the system so that you're keeping the workload level of the air traffic controllers at a manageable amount.
Okay, so more broadly speaking, what are some ways to eliminate shortages in air traffic controllers? Not necessarily during a government shutdown, but overall.
Well, I talked about the retirement age that needs to be adjusted as well. The educational path for air traffic controllers is rather long. You need a degree, you need go through training and various aspects in order to get to the point where you can manage some of this air traffic. So whether it's an incentive bonus for new air traffic controllers to come in and sign up. I mean, they're all members of unions, so they have union benefits, so they have a very good benefits package. They are well compensated for the work that they actually do. But in a lot of ways, this is endemic of a lot of what we see within the United States in terms of high tech or jobs that require very highly capable skill sets. And we're just not producing enough quality graduates out of our high schools in order to get to this point, or even out of our colleges, that folks can actually manage at this level. So there's some things that can be done at that level. The amount of training that has to be done is still pretty important. But as we continue to advance new forms of technology and improve the air traffic management system, that will ease the burden, ease the workload somewhat going forward. And a lot of these, you go in a lot of these towers across the country, and you're talking buildings that were built in the 1950s and 1960s. They're upgraded obviously with improved power, but they still run through issues. We saw a couple of times in the last couple of years. Communications outages, radar outages, that's a big problem. When something like that happens, then you necessarily must shunt all of your workload into a different center. So imagine that you're working, pretty hard, and all of a sudden your workload has doubled because there's been an outage in a particular piece of airspace. These are the kinds of things you have to manage on a regular basis, and you have to plan for them ahead, because when they actually occur, if you can't handle that workload, then that does become essentially a safety issue.
Okay, Armin, just finally, if you could look forward for us, look ahead. If the FAA is planning now to cut flights by 4% and then 10%, my worry is if the shutdown continues, could we see reductions beyond 10%?
Not just in air traffic controllers, but throughout government. I mean, working capital funds are running out of money. Money that's obligated on contracts for contractor support in the Department of Defense, that's limited. No new funds coming onto those things. So that work's going to slowly pause. This continues. You're going to see less and less work that's going to be happening, and more executive directions say, hey, you need to come in and work without a paycheck. I mean, I understand that, but also from the standpoint of the individual, how long can you actually work without a paycheck? There's a lot of blue states out there where folks are just barely making ends meet, and now you're being told to work on a regular basis, or you might get fired. And oh, by the way, we can't pay you right now. So the ramifications are they're nationwide. It's not just FAA controllers. It's millions of government workers that are affected by this, that do our social benefits, that handle the Food and Drug Administration folks, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services. Every function of government is being impacted by this. People are seeing it. People are feeling it. It's a very serious issue. It needs to stop. It needs to come to an end. We need to get this government back up and running. And the Republicans have put forth a clean continuing resolution that will do that and fund all these benefits. And the other side is simply being obstinate and saying no.
Okay, well, Armin, like you said, it is a very serious and unfortunate situation. I mean, maybe in the future they could find a way where political standoffs doesn't have to ground planes and have other impacts to the U.S. economy as well. Well, let's leave the conversation there today, Armin. It was so great to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. Have a great day.
The effects of the record-breaking government shutdown continue to mount as flight reductions at 40 major U.S. airports begin at 6 a.m. Eastern. The FAA said air traffic must be reduced by 4% from this morning. It will ramp up to 6% by November 11th, 8% by November 13th, and up to 10% by the 14th. Airlines preemptively canceled hundreds of flights ahead of the order. According to data from tracking website FlightAware, as of this morning, more than 1,000 U.S. flights were canceled. That's over 4 times the number of U.S. cancellations a day earlier. United, Southwest, and Delta Airlines already began canceling flights last night, affecting airports in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Yesterday evening, Delta said it will be canceling 170 flights today and fewer on Saturday because it's a lighter travel day. Southwest said it will cancel 120 flights for Friday, and United said it plans to cut 4% of its flights Friday through Sunday. We're showing a list of some of the affected airports here. Federal officials say reducing the Reducing the number of flights will make flying safer during the ongoing government shutdown. According to estimates, the flight cuts could represent as many as 1,800 flights and upwards of 260,000 seats combined. Here's more about the flight reductions.
I want to talk to you about the data. So first, some have asked what's happened in the airspace. So a few points that we look at that are sending us in the wrong direction. Right? So number one, loss of separation in the airspace. So that's the minimum distance we keep between aircraft to keep them safe. We've seen breaches, more breaches in regard to that loss of separation. We see more incursions on tarmacs throughout the country. And we have more complaints from pilots about stress from air traffic controllers and more complaints about the lack of responsiveness from controllers. So that data is going in the wrong direction, not in the right direction, which made us make the decision we have to actually take additional measures to reduce the pressure in our system.
Duffy said there's a higher level of fatigue with the air traffic controllers. They've been working 10-hour shifts 6 days a week. The Transportation Secretary said international flights will not be impacted because the U.S. has international agreements with foreign countries. But he did say that airlines will lose millions of dollars taking down flights, and they're not happy about the reductions. Duffy again urged senators to reopen the government and end the shutdown. If you're traveling soon, check the status of your flight with your airline. Some airline loyalty programs make it easier to cancel flights purchased with miles. The airlines that are temporarily providing waivers to change flights without fees include American, Delta, Southwest, United, and Frontier. Here are some more tips for people flying or booking flights in the near future.
There's a number of things you should be doing to be aware.
Experts say travelers who plan to fly soon should know their options. Experts advise people departing within 10 days to keep an eye on their airline's app for changes. They say carriers likely will try to preserve their hub-to-hub operations and cut regional flights instead.
It may not be a bad idea to delay travel if it's non-essential, or if you're in a smaller city, perhaps to drive to one of the larger hubs if it's close by, and also consider buying a backup ticket.
Several airlines are letting passengers change their flights for free. The law requires them to issue refunds for cancellations, but they're unlikely to reimburse stranded passengers for meals or hotels. For people planning to buy tickets soon, experts suggest booking with airlines directly. They say that makes it easier to change flights. They recommend avoiding layovers if possible. And the Transportation Secretary suggests bracing for Thanksgiving impacts if the government stays closed.
If we have staffing triggers and we don't have enough controllers in an airspace where we did cut 10%, you might see additional delays.
All right, Michigan lawmakers are finding out more about the Chinese regime's efforts to take photos and gather information at U.S. military installations. The head of the Michigan National Guard testified before state lawmakers this week about the practice.
The People's Republic of China are very active in their information gathering, intelligence collection. You see it through businesses, you see it through military sites, training. It's not uncommon. It's actually, I'd almost say it's pretty routine for Chinese nationals, PRC, People's Republic of China nationals, to be tasked to go somewhere and actively try to get onto a base, a military base, try to gain entry into a restricted area. And if they get entry, to collect certain pieces of information, whatever it may be of interest. But it's fairly routine and well established that this is an active, ongoing.
Major General Paul Rogers pointed to an incident in 2023. The military found 5 Chinese nationals taking photos near classified military equipment inside Camp Grayling in northern Michigan. That's the training facility for the Michigan Army National Guard. This led to an FBI investigation. The 5 were identified as Chinese students at the Michigan University, but they all managed to flee the U.S. to avoid arrest. The general warns that this is not an isolated incident, and it's been happening everywhere.
A year ago, we had 2 individuals show up at the gate at Selfridge Air National Guard Base. They wanted to go and visit the museum. And They were both PRC nationals, and they got turned away by the guards there because they're not allowed to have access. That alone is like, okay, well, that could happen, you know, if somebody's likes military aircraft and they want to show up somewhere. But the fact that those same two individuals showed up 3 days later at the same gate, hoping to find a guard that would not be doing their due diligence and tried to gain access again using the exact same excuse. It's a constant probing.
Yeah.
And it's a little cat and mouse, and they're not breaking any laws, right? So there's nothing that can be done about it, but you know it's not with good intent.
According to the Justice Department, back in 2023, Chinese nationals were sentenced to prison for illegally taking photos inside the U.S. Naval Air Station in Key West, Florida. Notably, 2 of them were also students at the University of Michigan. China's exports unexpectedly contracted in October 2025, marking the first decline in nearly 2 years. Joining us to discuss is Daniel Lacaille, chief economist at Tressis, international financial analyst and the author of the book Freedom or Equality. So Daniel, good afternoon to you. So what do you think the reason is that led to this contraction in exports?
Thank you very much. A number of reasons. Number one, the Chinese exporters have been unable to find alternative homes for their exports outside of the United States. And some of them have been unable to absorb the elevated levels of tariffs. Not only that, but many of these exporters have found themselves with very significant working capital challenges. So we have seen throughout the course of these months how the so repeated narrative that China would be able to basically offset all of its exports to the United States with alternative routes didn't happen. We also saw a significant crackdown on origin washing from the United States with the agreements with Vietnam and other countries. And all of this has put a very, very significant level of pressure on particularly those exporters that had narrower margins and were unable to absorb the tariffs.
So Daniel, has U.S. demand for Chinese products decreased because of tariffs? We're seeing exports to the U.S. down 25%.
Well, it's not that demand has declined, it's that there is demand for a very significant proportion of these products at the right price. You know, another of the things that I repeatedly debunked throughout all of the negative comments about the Liberation Day was this idea that United States customers had almost unlimited demand or inelastic demand no matter what the price. It is true that US customers have quite an appetite for cheap products as long as they're cheap. So when many of these exporters have been unable to absorb the tariffs and at the same time they have had to deal with rising freight charges and also rising financing charges, all those things have certainly created a competitive disadvantage for many of them, and they have been unable to sell elsewhere and definitely to find different countries that would purchase those products. The European Union, for example, has reduced quite significantly also its demand for some of the cheaper products, of the below $250 packages.
So Daniel, this contraction in exports, does China have enough capacity in terms of domestic consumption to offset that contraction of exports?
No, unfortunately, it doesn't. China is a very, very big economy, but it's a very poor economy when you look at what the average consumer has. About 60% of the population in China make less than $300 a month. And obviously, the ability of most Chinese citizens to save and to consume is massively lower than that of an American consumer in terms of access to credit, credit cards, and obviously the ability to save some money. No, so one of the problems that China is dealing with is the double whammy of overcapacity at an industrial level, in which most of the industries are dealing with much higher levels of capacity and production than what the internal demand and certainly external demand would suggest, added to an internal market that simply cannot be the solution to the challenges of exports abroad. We often hear from Chinese officials that if Chinese consumers increase their consumption by $1,000 a year, that would immediately solve all of the problems of the Chinese economy. Well, $1,000 a year is a fortune for the vast majority of Chinese citizens, which are way, way, way behind the figures that we see in cities like Shanghai or like Beijing.
So it seems like, based on what you're saying of Chinese officials, it seems like China does have a desire, right, to sort of rebalance its economy towards consumption-led growth. So what are the challenges? You mentioned some of them, but is it entirely possible, if given enough time, to rebalance its economy?
Well, if you remember, for example, the Japanese crisis at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the government was looking to offset the challenges of the external market by generating a level of stimulus for the internal demand. However, that obviously could happen because at the time, Japan had one of the most developed and richest consumers in the world. This is not the case in China. The problem is the following. You cannot bake the cake and eat it. You cannot, on the one hand, have an incredibly competitive, low-cost exporting and producing nation in which salaries are very, very low and in which employment is elevated, like the Chinese economy is, and at the same time expect that those citizens are going to offset the global demand of products by consuming more. It's virtually impossible. You cannot have a population that has very low wages, no relevant elements of social security, etc., very, very limited levels of protection, and at the same time expect them to consume significantly. That cannot happen. You would have to wait for the Chinese economy to become a high salary and high productivity economy, and that is way, way, way ahead, if any, in the future, because obviously the Chinese economy, unfortunately, in the last 10 years has been closing instead of opening. No? So you cannot basically be, on the one hand, a cheap labor country while having large domestic consumers.
So, Daniel, how do you assess the long-term outlook then for China's economy based on what you're seeing as the current trajectory headed?
Well, they obviously need a trade deal urgently. That's very, very clear. We see it in the working capital figures of the Chinese companies. We see it in the industrial figures. We see it in the port figures, all of it. That shows that there is an absolute urgency of a trade deal. Number two, that trade deal must come with the opening of the Chinese economy and becoming more open also about human rights, about intellectual property, so many things in which they're lagging behind compared to other nations. No? So the opportunities for China are gigantic. It's obviously a very productive, hugely efficient country in which there's tremendous level of seriousness and commitment from the labor force, etc. But all those things cannot happen if the economy does not open, independent institutions are not implemented, and at the same time, the challenges of intellectual property and human rights are not addressed. All those things can be addressed, but it cannot happen with all these plans that basically seem to look at the past of socialist central planning as the solution for the future. That is not going to work.
Okay, Daniel, just one final question. Do you see China's export sector picking up? And what is your advice for those looking to invest in China right now?
I do see the Chinese exporting sector picking up if there is a trade deal, which is something that we need to see very, very clearly. So for those investors looking at the depressed companies that are facing all these challenges that I just mentioned, I would say maybe there is an opportunity, but you need to wait for a trade deal. You need to have a solid, clear trade deal in which China commits to opening the economy and eliminating all of these trade barriers that we have mentioned so many times. And then you may see an immediate positive reaction, but you need to see the trade deal. You cannot just wait for months on end thinking that these companies are going to solve their problems, because those are created by all these challenges that I have mentioned throughout the interview.
Well, all right, Daniel, it's always good to speak with you, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Same to you. Thank you very much, Don. Always a pleasure.
The federal government says it has revoked 80,000 visas this year as part of a sweeping national security effort. The State Department said today the revocations involved individuals linked to terrorism, crime, or public safety threats, as well as visa overstays. Officials also said 16,000 visas were canceled this year for DUI offenses, 12,000 for assault, and 8,000 for theft. The State Department says the Trump administration will not hesitate to revoke visas from foreigners who undermine our laws or threaten national security. Recently, the department invalidated visas of foreign nationals for publicly celebrating the assassination of Turning Point founder Charlie Kirk. Democrats have criticized the Trump administration's revocation of student visas, saying it's been done in many cases without justification or explanation. The State Department said 80,000 visas have been revoked. Joining us to discuss is Gerard Filitti, a foreign affairs analyst and attorney specializing in international law. So Gerard, good afternoon to you. How much discretion does the administration have to revoke visas on this scale?
The administration has tremendous discretion under the law, under immigration statutes, to revoke visas and to deny access or entry to America by foreign nationals. As a condition for entry in the United States, you're agreeing to a set of conditions. These include not committing crime. It includes not taking policy positions that are adverse to U.S. policy interests. So essentially, the government has a large latitude in removing immigrants on a visa, whether that's a temporary or a work visa or a student visa, if they do not agree with the conduct of these immigrants.
So can you clarify for us legally what constitutes as a threat to national security? This has been referenced as for some of the reasons for the revocations. How is the general term support for terrorism interpreted?
Support for terrorism is interpreted as it is in federal laws that deal with support for terrorism, meaning advocacy beyond just words for terrorist organizations. However, what's different is that the federal government can determine that support is not just a terrorist support, but it is a foreign policy consideration. So really, we have to draw the distinction between two different categories. Terrorist support, as we call it colloquially, as we're talking about it on air, doesn't really mean material support, doesn't really mean helping a terrorist organization. What it means in the eyes of the Trump administration is taking a foreign policy position that's adverse to the interests of America. For example, supporting Hamas against Israel or supporting other designated terrorist organizations, propagandizing for them. So it's not the same type of material support, for example, providing weapons or money, but it is providing propaganda services and advocating for them.
And Gerard, how do you view the administration's screening of social media accounts of visa holders? Is this acting within the law?
It is acting within the law for most visa holders from most countries where we do not have an easy access reciprocal treaty. People who apply for visas have to undergo screening. In many parts of the world, they have to present themselves to the U.S. embassy or consulate for an interview and provide all sorts of biographical and background information, including criminal background checks about themselves in order to get that visa. So this is definitely not unprecedented. This is the way the system works. What's different now is that the administration is vigorously looking at the social media profiles of people that have already been admitted to the country, arguing that the Biden administration and prior administrations were very lax when it came to these background checks.
So can you address this, Gerard? Because legal visa holders in the U.S. have some First Amendment protections as well. So could you address how the visas of 6 foreigners accused of celebrating Charlie Kirk's death were revoked?
Well, that's the issue that ultimately may have to be heard by the Supreme Court. We all understand that First Amendment protections apply within America. However, there has traditionally been a carve-out in immigration law that does not apply the entirety of the First Amendment rights that you have the freedom of speech to people who hold these visas, for the simple reason that the government can regulate who it allows in the country and on what grounds. So it's very much like being a guest in someone's house when you're here on a visa. If you're saying things, you don't have the same liberties that you would if you were a citizen by birth or naturalization of the United States. So for many years, courts have held a distinction between between the First Amendment rights enjoyed by American citizens and those applied to people who are here on a visa. Now, when it comes to the nature of the speech, when we have speech that is so shocking and traumatic that it affects the national security of the United States, or it propagandizes murder, or it encourages violent acts, then that's not going to be held when it's done by foreigners to the same First Amendment protections as a citizen would have.
Okay, so Gerard, I want to present this argument to you. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but can it or can it not be argued that a certain degree of ideological vetting might help ensure that individuals entering the country share at least, a baseline respect for democracy and human rights?
Well, I think ideological vetting would be something that could show whether someone is sharing the values and principles, the democratic values and principles of the United States. But in practice, this is very different to implement because we don't really know what is in a person's heart and mind. The best we can do is look at statements this person has made, look at their criminal background, look at their educational background, and see whether there's anything in their history that suggests animosity to our values. That's what the Trump administration is doing now in vetting foreigners, looking to see what it can tell about the character of these people and whether admitting them to the United States will pose a danger because their character is inherently contrary to American principles of democracy.
Can you speak to the difference, if any, between free speech protections for foreign nationals in the U.S. versus actual citizens?
To some extent, and there has not been that much jurisprudence, that much law about this over the years. There have been some cases, but not nearly enough. And I do think the Supreme Court will ultimately weigh in. But the way things have been interpreted is it's almost a sliding scale. When you're a citizen, pretty much everything is First Amendment that's not slander, defamatory, a threat, or incitement to violence. When you are here on a visa, that depends, your speech protections depend on the nature of your speech. If you are arguing or propagandizing against the US government, for example, or supporting terrorism, that's not going to be protected by the First Amendment. If, on the other hand, you are merely saying something that some people dislike but otherwise does not impact the US government or foreign policy or national security, courts will probably rule that you do have a First Amendment right to say it. So the bottom line is it depends on what people are saying when they exercise their First Amendment rights.
So, Gerard, do legal visa holders have the right to challenge any revocation in court?
Generally speaking, there are some protections. There are some due process protections. And again, it depends on the type of visa. It depends on whether you're here as a visitor on a visitor visa, which can very easily be revoked. It's not the same level of scrutiny, for example, as if you are here on a work visa or an immigrant visa. If you are here on the type of visa that gives you residency in the United States, then you can have that challenge with an immigration court. You do have rights to exercise to fight the revocation and the deportation. But if you're merely here as a visitor, then you are pretty much out of luck.
Okay, Gerard, just to end the interview, can you talk to us about what you think might be the impacts of such revocations at such a scale?
Well, I think the impact on this is playing out more on university campuses than anywhere else, because this is one of the populations that's largely affected. We had some 8,000 revocations of student visas in this batch. And when you're revoking student visas, universities change in nature. We know that we have many students, especially graduate students at Harvard and many other institutions who are here, whether it's from communist China or from other countries, that are benefiting from our education system. So these revocations change the character, maybe for the better, of our education system. But in general, the message it sends to foreigners is that we will hold you to the same standards that you hold us. Many countries, most countries, have restrictions on immigration and visitors to their countries. What we're doing is merely doing what other countries do, which is vetting the people we allow in.
Okay, Gerard, always good to talk to you. Hope you have a great weekend. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you.
What could have been a normal soccer match in Britain instead saw Israeli fans banned from attending due to public security concerns. Pro-Palestinian groups protested against the Maccabi Tel Aviv soccer team, while counter-protesters opposed the ban on Israeli fans. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more.
Israeli soccer fans were banned from attending a Europa League match in Birmingham, England, where Maccabi Tel Aviv played against Aston Villa on Thursday. Israeli sports teams are a focus for pro-Palestinian protests, with some past incidents turning violent. Aston Villa initially said away fans would be barred on police advice, and the Maccabi club reluctantly opted against selling tickets to their fans. Now, this comes in the wake of rising anti-Semitism in Britain and across Europe. Maccabi fans were hunted down by pro-Palestinian protesters at a soccer match in Amsterdam in the Netherlands last year. Around 60 people were arrested last year in Amsterdam. Social media footage showed fans running for their lives, attackers yelling "Free Palestine," an unconscious body kicked on the ground, and groups of men checking people's passports to see if they were Israeli. 5 people were treated in hospital. Netherlands police said Maccabi supporters burned a Palestinian flag, pulled down another and vandalized a taxi. In England, Birmingham police said the threat to Maccabi fans was a consideration, but said the main driver for the ban was the actions of some fans.
We have intelligence and information that says that there is a section of Maccabi fans, not all Maccabi fans, but a section of them who engage in quite significant levels of hooliganism.
The chief executive of Maccabi Tel Aviv said some elements in the club are not in line with the club's values and morals.
But to malign thousands and thousands of good fans with the actions of a few, it's a dangerous game.
British police mounted a large operation with 700 officers to prevent trouble in the city, which has a large Muslim population. One side of the stadium saw around 200 pro-Palestinian protesters with banners calling for a boycott of Israel. On the other side of the stadium, a smaller counter-protest against anti-Semitism. Mark Burbeck said the ban is part of a bigger anti-Israel campaign.
So various political groups and activists, Ayub Khan, for example, the local MP, and various other activists have been campaigning in order to kick Israel out of FIFA, to kick Maccabi Tel Aviv out of UEFA.
Member of Parliament Ayub Khan said there was a moral argument as well as a safety one, arguing for a boycott of the game because of the war in Gaza. A Maccabi fan expressed his frustration that fans could not take part in a normal way.
We wanted to come and take part of a celebration of football for us tonight, and we've been robbed of our opportunity to do so. It's nothing to do with that particular club or those particular fans. I don't see any reason why we would have. We would have issue with the Islamist mob, that's definitely. But I expect the police to deal with the aggressors, not with the victims. That's how it works in a law and order country.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer had previously called for the ban on Maccabi fans to be overturned, saying it was the wrong decision. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, Birmingham.
As another candidate enters the race for New York governor occurred, Governor Kathy Hochul says she's happy to battle every day in next year's election. NTD's Sean Marshall has more.
Representative Elise Stefanik announced on November 7th that she is running for governor of New York, taking on incumbent Democrat Kathy Hochul. Stefanik has released statements over the past year criticizing Hochul. She also sought to tie Hochul to New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani, a Democratic socialist who won the city's election on Tuesday. In a campaign launch video shared on social media, Stefanik called Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul the worst governor in America and called New York the most unaffordable state in the nation.
The Empire State has fallen.
People are just going crazy over the amount of taxes here.
There's no question, New York is facing an affordability crisis.
Escape from New York, the tax base has been fleeing the Empire State.
Top leaders in New York City say a wave of migrant crime has washed over the city. Foreign gang members terrorizing innocent New Yorkers.
Complete disregard for the law and
Flashing images of Mamdani on the screen, the video claims Hochul cozied up to a defund the police, tax-hiking, anti-Semitic communist. Hochul's team quickly fired back with a video referring to Stefanik as Trump's #1 cheerleader, part of an effort to closely link the GOP lawmaker to the president.
Meet Elise Stefanik.
The greatest president in the history of our country, President Donald J. Trump.
She's Donald Trump's top ally in Congress.
I'm proud to be one of his top allies on Capitol Hill. This goes back to fighting against the witch hunt impeachment. It goes back to being the first member of Congress who endorsed.
My message to Trump's top ally, bring it on, Hochul said. Hochul endorsed New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani. Stefanik, in September, criticized her for the endorsement, calling Mamdani a communist who will destroy New York, making it less affordable and more dangerous. Once again, putting criminals and communists first, and New Yorkers last. Still, with more than a combined $13 million cash on hand, Stefanik has tapped a number of former Trump advisors and longtime aides who worked in finance, communications, and operations roles to help launch her campaign. Sean Marshall, NTD News.